Um, so, so our program tonight, we're very honoured to welcome our guest this evening, Ruben Gurevich, an internationally renowned conductor, violinist, educator, producer and writer, who will be talking about matters of consideration for curators and directors in the programming of music, as well as responsibilities that composers and performers have towards one another, and also maybe about how we could possibly get our works performed. After the talk, there will be some time for some questions. Please ensure until then that you keep your microphone off to avoid any disturbance during the presentation. If you have any comments or questions during the talk, please do use the chat function and we will do our best to address these at the end. And now I will tell you a bit about the guest we're having this evening. Ruben Gurevich is originally from Montevideo. I'm not sure if I pronounced that right. In Uruguay?
Uruguay.
Sorry, Uruguay. Right?
Yes.
Okay. And was just 16 when he held his first position as first violin in the National Symphony Orchestra of Uruguay. In addition to his studies in music and conducting, he studied philosophy, physics, and mathematics, and was awarded postgraduate scholarships, which allowed him to attend various prestigious universities in North America. After moving to Canada, he began an active career in conducting and performance, where he founded the Manitoba Chamber Orchestra, became the principal guest conductor of the Winnipeg Symphony Orchestra, in addition to various other Canadian orchestras. He also conducted in various symphony and chamber orchestras in the United States, Latin America, and Europe. In addition to his role as conductor and director, he has also led orchestral music programs at the California State University and various other institutions, California, Seattle, and Tacoma. In acknowledgement of his accomplishments as educator, he was later invited by the Chinese government to conduct various symphony orchestras and give postgraduate seminars in Shanghai and Beijing. As a consultant, he has advised leading performing organizations in Canada and the USA in matters of artistic, administrative, financial, developmental, and marketing strategies. He has written various essays, articles, and novels, including a multi-volume study entitled Mozart, Man, Musician, and Mason, in which the composer and his era are contextualized within the European cultural matrix. Currently, he continues his work as educator and consultant, advising musicians on matters related to the musical profession as a science and an art form. And so now over to you, Ruben, without any further delay.
Well, thank you. I thought we were going to start with a performance of your piece.
Oh, I thought like it's a bit random, so I cut that off the program.
Okay, well, whatever. Well, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to congratulate you, Eliora, and everyone else who has been involved in creating and continuing this forum. I think the present situation in the world with the pandemic has forced us to rely more and more and more and ways to communicate with each other. And I think what you have created in this forum is very valuable. Looking around the people who are here, I can see that most of you are composers. I also see that, and I imagine that as composers, you also play at least one instrument at a high level. I also see my friend Murray, who, in addition to being a professional retired psychologist and a world champion in chess, he's a guitar player who has performed at the Chicago House of Blues and exemplifies what I would call a well-educated member of an audience for a music ensemble or a music performance in any case. I would like to address three main topics. The first one, starting with my own experience, as a music director and conductor. First of all, in North America, it is customary that the same individual who is the principal conductor of an ensemble, not a guest conductor, but the principal conductor, is also the music director, which means that that person is responsible for programming a season. And it is absolutely essential that that person have the necessary awareness of what the needs of that programming is, to what the performances of that ensemble are addressed, etc. The first organization of which I was music director, I have been conducting professionally for a number of years, but the first organization of which I was the music director is the Manitoba Chamber Orchestra, which I founded in Winnipeg, Canada in 1972. And as reflected in the mission statement of that organization, we were going to perform music adequate for the instrumentation which we had, which was basically about 18 strings plus added winds and added strings as needed, or percussion or whatever. But music from the Baroque, in some cases we actually performed Renaissance music, through music composed in our days. Quite a few of them we commissioned ourselves. So the need of the audience of that particular ensemble, and later on the many symphony orchestras I was conductor and music director, means that we had to take into consideration three things. First of all, what is the responsibility of a conductor, I would say of any performer, towards the music of the past and the music of his or her own time? No conductor who knows what he or she is doing would even attempt to begin to conduct unless first we have a complete as possible knowledge of everything that has to do with musical disciplines, besides playing at least one instrument at a professional level, hopefully more. And certainly if piano is not your main instrument, at least have good knowledge of the piano, because it helps. It's not essential, but it helps a lot. But also all the other areas of music, meaning all the boring exercise in counterpoint, harmony, fugue, etc., 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 and an awareness of the music that is being written, not just in the decades before that particular conductor begins his studies or her studies, but being written today. In my own case, I studied composition very well with a very good composer who, not to Murray, has specialized for guitar, but he had written many, many works in all genres, and all media, I mean. And by the time I was 21, when I came to the United States to do postgraduate work, I had written quite a few works in all kinds of media, including voice, strings, orchestra, etc., etc. I decided at that time that even though the music I wrote, most of which was in a free atonal way, quite tonal, quite atonal, etc. But the music I wrote in that kind of language, I decided it had been done better by someone else before. And my first love was not only the violin, which was my main instrument, but primarily conducting, which I wanted to do since I was a little child. So I concentrated on conducting. The responsibility, my responsibility, and the responsibility of any conductor towards the ensemble that that person is conducting and towards the audience of that ensemble depends on the mission of that ensemble. As I told you, the mission of the Manitoba Chamber Orchestra is music of all styles, and the symphony orchestras I conducted are also to perform music of all styles. Conversely, the 20th Century Players, a professional ensemble in Los Angeles I conducted for 3 years, as the name implies, its mission is to perform the music of contemporary, by then I mean late 20th century composers. I conducted them in the 80s, so there were no 21st century composers then. So it all depends on what the mission statement of that ensemble is. Now, I want to say right off the bat that the battle or the war to have contemporary music performed has been won. You don't have to fight those battles anymore. Any performer or music director, conductor worth his or her salt will include music by contemporary composers in the general programming. Also, a venue that many orchestras, including with Winnipeg and Quebec, which I also organized, have created a contemporary music festival in which not just, let's say, a music by Schoenberg or Corigliano or Xenakis would be programmed in the general season, but in the festival, which usually consists of 6 or 7 performances over a period of a week or 2, exclusively contemporary composers are programmed. So you don't have to worry about that. Any music director, conductor that you would approach, and I'll get to that later, will be interested in performing contemporary music for some programming or other. So that, to me, it's a responsibility that I have taken very seriously. I have over 60 years of experience as a professional musician and over 50 years experience as a conductor, music director. And I have taken and continue taking my responsibilities towards all styles of music, including contemporary composers, living composers, very seriously. Now, any questions so far? Okay, let's continue. I'll answer questions later. The second thing I want to address, or the second subject, is the responsibility of a composer, especially a young composer, towards himself or herself. First of all, I am assuming that all of you have a very solid grounding on the music written by composers of the past, from the Renaissance through 20th and 21st century. If you don't, I urge you, in whatever area you feel you have a weakness, please do quite a bit of study there. We learned a lot, and every composer of note has learned from composers of the past and have taken the lessons they learned from those composers very seriously, and they have applied to their own liking, to their own preference, to their own idea on how to create music. In my life, I have met many, many living composers. One of my mentors was a wonderful composer called Sophie Carmen Eckart Gramate. We called her Sonia, a genius who played violin and piano at a professional level, and she studied at Paris Conservatoire under when Fauré was the director. Her piano examiners were Debussy, Ravel, and I don't remember who else. And she was one of my mentors. Unfortunately, she died in an accident in the early 70s, but I learned a lot from her. And I met many composers through the 20th century players in Los Angeles. I met composers like John Cage, Reich, John Adams. I interacted not with composers, but the performers of the Kronos String Quartet, etc., etc. And all of them have absolute solid grounding on the music of the past. You cannot innovate if you don't know what you are departing from. You cannot innovate if you don't know what you're innovating about. Otherwise, you're perpetually condemned to reinvent the wheel. So for a composer who wants to write a work for a percussion ensemble, for instance, it would be not advisable to ignore the fantastic repertoire of pieces composed just for for percussion ensemble by people like Varese, Xenakis, Buried, and many, many, many others. So again, imbue yourselves in a particular style with the basis of what you have learned from the past, and be aware of who your progenitors or predecessors are in the particular media that you want to write. For instance, I recall the first time I attended this forum, Eliora, you played a piece in which somebody was playing inside the piano, which is an idea that started probably with John Cage, but you took your own view on that and you created a piece that, in my opinion, is very good. And any performer interested in contemporary music, approached the right way, more to that later, will be happy to perform. The other thing that I want to emphasize, and I would read from an early email that I sent to Eliora a couple of months ago, et cetera, et cetera. I mentioned the composers that I interacted with in Los Angeles, and then these plus the long list of works by 20th century composers I've conducted: Schoenberg, Berg, Webern, Varese, Ligeti, Lutoslavski, Penderecki, Stockhausen, etc. has allowed me to acquire a good grasp of 20th century composers and their works. And here's where I'm coming to. Paraphrasing the well-known saying, I believe that the proof is in the listening. I find that regardless of how fascinating the intellectual underpinnings of a given work may be, unless those ideas coalesce in a musical composition which conveys something, quote, meaningful to a, quote, well-educated ear, what both those concepts may be is the subject of another discussion, that piece remains an interesting, albeit ultimately forgettable exercise, which hopefully will lead to a more, quote, realized composition, another discussion. What I mean by that is that all composers, and especially young composers who are relatively inexperienced, must be aware what they're writing for. If you're writing for yourselves to develop certain techniques, or if you're writing for a workshop in which your experiments in various areas of composition are well received, you are not going to be well served if those experiments are put under the eye of a well-known performer, including a music director conductor, with the view that that piece be included in their programming. They are looking for pieces that are, as I call them, realized. After you have assimilated all the knowledge that you can, and after you have done a lot of experiments, for instance, what can the different percussion instruments can do, being timbral or not timbral instruments, etc. You put it all together the best way you can in a piece that is no longer, whose purpose is no longer to serve as a display of various techniques, but a piece of music in itself. I recall last month we heard a very good piece by Cameron for cello solo performed by a terrific cellist. And I remember that in the course of the discussion, Cameron said something that very much corresponds to what I'm saying today, which is, when I wrote this piece, I didn't set out to do or to prove a point. I just set out to write a piece of music. And that is extremely important. Do a lot of study and a lot of experimentation, but leave that to your own study, to your own studio, and to workshops. When you write for a professional ensemble, put it all together the best way you can and just create music. Trust yourselves that everything you have learned until the point you're writing this piece has been assimilated. Of course, you start with an idea. No one starts with a piece of music just out of thin air. But the idea is just the springboard, and then let your music imagination, your music intuition filter through and augmented by your musical knowledge, be the underpinnings of that music you're creating. I also speak of the responsibility of the composer towards our times. And I'm going to use an example that I have used a few times of an absolutely brilliant and very talented young composer, British composer. I believe she's living in Vienna now. And it's her name, first name is Amanda, I believe, Amanda Deutsch, I think. And in her case, Amanda has chosen self-consciously or consciously to write music in a style that has been the style of 120 years ago. Now, to me, that is not what a modern composer or a living composer should do. I grant her absolute incredible talent, but even when she introduces some non 19th century, early 20th century, tonal early 20th century details, it's like you putting blob of ink on a printing by Picasso or something like that. You're just adding something, well, no, a printing by Rubens, Picasso's 20th century. But anyway, it's just adding, to me, it's like adding an inconsequential detail to something that doesn't need it. So composers like her and many others I met before, including some Canadian composers, who write in a style that has been not dead, but a product of 120 years ago, is not advisable. If she doesn't change, she's going to remain, in my opinion, I've been wrong before, but she's going to remain a footnote in the history of music. So you owe it to yourselves to be aware of everything else and create in a style that makes sense to you. To me, an example of a composer who has created a whole slew of pieces in a traditional style, filtered through his idea of contemporary music, is the American composer John Corigliano. Corigliano, yes, he writes music for film, and in that case, it's very tonal and very traditional. He wrote the music for the film Red Violin, and then he wrote a number of pieces, including the Red Violin Concerto for violin and symphony orchestra. But the pieces that he writes in general are tonal, quasi-tonal, but filtered through his understanding of contemporary music. And I think that's very important for all of you to do. Any questions so far? I'll move on.
Yes, sorry. I'm just gonna read some questions we've got from the message, the comment part. Is that okay?
Can we do it at the end?
Okay. Go on.
Please,
yeah, sure.
Let me finish and we'll do it at the end.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Okay. Now the question which may be of burning interest to you, how to get your piece looked at and performed by a performer, conductor of repute. Well, in my opinion, based on my experience, that's a combination of various elements. First of all, you have to prove yourselves in organizations or performers who are more inclined to perform music by young composers or living composers in general. So you have to develop some kind of, I wouldn't call it reputation, but some kind of background where you're recognized as a serious composer. Let me tell you, in my experience, and I am certainly not alone in that, music directors, conductors are bombarded with requests and scores and recordings, most of them made at home, of pieces by living composers. no matter how much interest we may have on that kind of music, we don't have the time to wade through tons of scores and recordings, etc. I am a very fast score reading, but in order to understand what a piece of music is all about, especially a contemporary piece, it would require sitting down with the score, going through it, analyzing it, figuring out what the composer is trying to do, and then decide for myself if I want to play the piece or not. The only way that a composer, a conductor, or any other performer is going to take the time and the trouble to do that is twofold. If you have already developed a name that your pieces are being performed either in festivals or by ensembles that are particularly geared to that kind of music. By that kind, I mean contemporary music, or in the case of Cameron's piece, these cellists, etc. Once you have developed the name, make sure that the piece you send is, as I said, a realized piece. Whatever, and I cannot emphasize this enough, leave your experimentation in your studio. It doesn't mean that your piece cannot be experimental. Yes, it can be, but it has to be a complete and finished piece. When Varese premiered Ionization, in 1928, it was a totally experimental piece for the times, but it was a completely finished piece. Varese was a very intellectual composer, like was Xenakis and Schoenberg, but the analysis of a piece comes after they wrote it. They decide to write a piece for this kind of instruments. They decided to write it according to these guidelines, and then they compose. And then they spend afterwards whatever time they need to do to analyze the piece if they want to discuss it for anybody else. Schoenberg is a typical example of that. He wrote music, period. Even when he was creating the 12-tone style, yes, that was a conscious way of trying to organize atonality. By the way, Schoenberg hated the word atonality, and I agree with him. Anytime that a cluster of sounds or a sound is played, a tonality is established. I think what we mean by atonal music is music that in which the tonal center changes so rapidly, sometimes sound by sound, that it doesn't have a continuing relationship of tonal centers like, quote, tonal music. Anyway, that's an aside. So Schoenberg writes music and then writes a number of books analyzing what he has done. And there's a famous example in his analysis of the four orchestral songs of 1928 for soprano and orchestra, which he spends a lot of time explaining what he set out to do. But that comes afterwards. The analysis of the piece comes afterwards. So to reiterate my advice is get your piece performed by the people that you know, who are willing to perform your music right now. If you have a friend who is a performer of note, like Cameron approached the cellist for his cello piece, by all means approach that performer. If you have a conductor who's a friend of yours, approach that conductor. He or she may perform that piece or may not, but it may give you advice or at least tell you why he or she is not going to perform it. So the two pieces of advice I have for you is develop some kind of a name for yourself, or three pieces, I mean. Approach your friends, but have pieces that are finished pieces, realized pieces, and make sense for themselves. I suggest that if you're going to approach the music director of any of the London orchestras or any of the other orchestras in the UK, or if you approach Simon Rattle, I mean, in Birmingham, etc., he's not going to have the time to look at your pieces unless another musician that he trusts recommends that he looked at your piece. So that's the best advice I can give you right now as far as how to get your piece performed. Eliora, you mentioned that you have a piece that you wanted to, I don't know, write or convert into a piece performed by Iranian instruments. I see absolutely nothing wrong in that, except that be aware that it has a very focused goal, a very focused audience, and a limited way in which the piece is going to be known by the musical world in general. If that is your goal, to write a piece just for this kind of ensemble, by all means do it. If your goal is to write for all kinds of ensemble, then write this piece and go on to do something else that it would be more along the lines of the more traditional ensembles in the UK, etc., etc. Adafe, I believe you're an expert in one of the Iranian instruments. I heard a beautiful piece that Eliora wrote for flute and your instrument. And again, I commend you for that. But as a composer, you have to be clear what your goals are. And if your goals are to be performed by, I hate to use the word average, but the average type of musical ensemble, then you have to concentrate more and more in writing music for that kind of instrumentalist or ensemble. And now, thank you very much for your time. And I believe I will welcome any comments or any questions that you may have, including if you disagree with me violently, I mean, mildly or vehemently. Tell me whatever you think. Thank you.
Adafe, will you read out the comments?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Ruben. I'm just reading Sian comments. He said, what would you say about conveying the intended meaning to an uneducated ear?
That is an absolutely wonderful question. And I will tell you what I endeavor to do. In all traditional ensembles, of which I was music director and conductor, I told you I was trying to incorporate music by 20th century composers and living composers. But I never was silly enough to perform that kind of music to an audience most of whom would have been much happier listening to Vivaldi or Bach or, let's say, the neoclassical Stravinsky or whatever. So what I did is take the time to turn around and tell the audience present there how to, what the piece is all about. I remember a beautiful anecdote. I was performing, the orchestra conducted by me, we were performing Varèse Octandre, a piece by a mixed ensemble of winds, brass, and double bass. And I spent quite a bit of time asking the members of the orchestra, not just the members of the octet, but the rest who was there, because the Octandre is a very short piece, I believe it's 6-7 minutes, I don't remember, to play not just excerpts from that piece, but illustrate those excerpts with examples of what other composers like Bach or Mozart, how they try to do something similar and in which way they approach that particular task. After that, and we spent probably much longer doing that than the actual length of the piece. And then we performed the piece. After the performance, one of the subscribers, a lady, which to me was ancient, she must be 60, I'm 76. But anyway, came to me and said, Mr. Gurevich, I really appreciate the explanations you gave for that piece by Varèse. I said, oh, I'm so glad you enjoy it. Did you like the piece? No, I hated it, but at least now I know why I hate it. You know, what a well-educated ear or a well-educated member of the audience is someone, in my opinion, someone who, through listening to the repertoire performed by symphony orchestra, chamber orchestras, singers, ensembles, soloists, etc., is well aware of all the repertoire and understands or is familiar intellectually with the differences between one style and another, and is part of the role of the music director conductor to contribute to the education of that audience. And by that I mean by introducing or programming pieces by living composers. And if necessary, I also, with the various symphony orchestras, I did the same when I was playing, conducting pieces not so, let's say, new as Varèse, but for instance, you know, I remember in one of my performances of Petrushka, by Stravinsky, of course, I turned around to the audience and explained that it was a piece written for ballet and what the whole goal of it was. And then I called attention to some compositional techniques that Stravinsky had used in the piece. Does that answer your question about what a well-educated listener is?
Actually, he mentioned yes. I really agree, and the openness to share in the moment. Okay, and we have one more question. What and where may we learn of curators and programmers of the past?
I don't understand what you mean by curator. Can you tell me?
Actually, Sion asked, Sion, can you explain
Yeah,
what?
certainly. So you mentioned earlier on that we must learn from the composers of the past and have a thorough grounding of which is understood. I kind of attended this event as a understanding that it would be about curating and programming and those sort of areas of discussion as well as. And I just wondered what can we learn from the programmers and the curators of programs? historically from the past? How did they program? What decisions that they made?
Okay. Until well into the 19th century, practically every piece of music performed by an ensemble, including a symphony orchestra or a choir, was music by living composers. The notion of programming as a repository for, as someone said before, I don't remember whom, music by dead white European composers is very new, relatively speaking. It starts in the 19th century and it continued through a large part of the 20th century. What we can learn from the programmers of the past, we should learn from the best. We should learn from Stokowski, who was performing Varese and Stravinsky and many other pieces as music director of the Philadelphia Orchestra in the 1920s. We should learn from Kusevitsky, who was doing the same with the Boston Symphony, including a whole slew of American composers who received, if not the first, at least the first important performance by the Boston Symphony under his direction, and who also commissioned many pieces, including the Bartok Concerto for Orchestra. So I think that's what we can learn from the best programmers of the past. As far as being a curator in a museum, that's not my area of expertise, but I mentioned my mentor, Sonia. Her second husband was Dr. Ferdinand Eckart, who for years was the director of the Winnipeg Art Gallery. And he understood very, very, very well his responsibility towards arts of all eras, including the era in which he was living. So does that answer your question? Thank you. Anything else?
Sian, you have another question here, I can see.
I do. I have lots of questions.
Well, ask them. This is the time.
It's written there. So you mentioned your mission in Manitoba was to, excuse my paraphrasing, you said something like to play all types of music, worse to that effect. And I get that as a very clear programming intention that we want to make all kinds of things available. My question within that is, what effect do you intend to have through those programming choices that you do end up making? So while you might want to program a variety of everything, you do make certain choices. What is the actual driving effect that you would want to state? You probably guessed I'm a kind of curator, programmer, mentor kind of person.
Yeah. Well, again, a very good question. My first goal, after being, if I may be bold enough to say, negatively impressed by mediocre performances of any piece of any style, my first goal is that whatever piece and whatever style we would perform, it would be the best performance that I, at the time, I was in my mid-20s when I started, was able to do with the group of first-rate musicians I had in front of me. So my first goal is the quality of the performance. The first goal is to, by introducing pieces that the average audience member would not turn the radio, put a record to listen to introduce them to a music they were not familiar with. and to do it in such a way that it is not a shock. The example of the woman I told you was an exception. Most other people who commented after the performance or a later time on the piece that we performed and the explanations we gave enjoy the piece because they have something to grab onto. So does that answer your question? Thank you.
We have another question from Ronnie. He said he really liked and appreciate what you said about part of the role of the conductor being to educate the audience. To what extent and how do you think us composers need to educate conductors about our own music, including very educated conductors?
Unless you want to be thrown out of the conductor's office, don't go to the conductor's office with that goal in mind. The best way you can educate a conductor about your music is to write the best composition you can and present it to that conductor and tell the conductor, this is what I intended to do. This is what I have done. I think I accomplished it the best way I could at this time in my development. I would appreciate it very much if you look at it. But if you go with the idea, okay, I'm going to go and educate Simon Rattle on what contemporary music is all about. I mean, Simon is a very, very charming man and very polite, but I think you would last in his office for about another 15 seconds. So it's not just what you intend to do, but how do you go about doing it? Yes, having worked together with many composers, the dialogue between a composer and the conductor or any other performer who takes that piece is essential for the conductor's understanding of the piece and a faithful interpretation of the piece. But sometimes composers are wrong. I remember at one point, I was performing a piece by Sonia, and I was sitting at her house, sitting at a Bösendorfer piano that belonged to Ferdinand's mother, who had been signed inside by Brahms, talk about history. So I was sitting with Sonia, I was sitting at the piano, and at a certain point, I was playing the piece, and I turned around and said, Sonia, is that really what you mean? And she looked at it and said, Ach Gott, I made a mistake. So she changed, you know. So it's a two-way street. In the case of a performance by a piece of a contemporary composer, the dialogue composer-conductor is a two-way dialogue. A well-experienced conductor can advise a relatively inexperienced composer about how certain things may be done better. I wouldn't go as far as the case of Bruckner, who heard everyone criticize his pieces and changed them a whole bunch of times. But if you present a piece to a well-knowledgeable performer, including conductor, and the conductor advises you something, before you dismiss it out of hand, listen to it and think about it. You may persist in what you were doing before, or you may decide that, okay, maybe this is better. You know, don't forget that the act of composition and recomposition in the case of a performer is an ongoing process. It never ends. I think a best example of that is if you listen to the Rachmaninoff piano concertos played by the composer, how each of them is quite a bit different than the others. The piece is always the same, but there are details that are different. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much. I didn't mean educate in inverted commas. I don't think that came out when reading it. So I didn't mean to. I meant how much we should explain, and but in exactly the way you explained. Thank you.
I think you should explain it if the conductor asks for an explanation, or beforehand give him guidelines. This is what I intended to do. This is the best I can do at this point in my development. This is the piece. I would hope you consider it.
I mean, I have had the experience of not being asked anything, just being told to present the piece. The conductor just played it with his orchestra and didn't ask me anything. And I found out later he'd also was missing the page of the explanations. And so, yeah, that was a bit of a disappointment to me. And he didn't even meet me to ask anything about the piece.
Well,
so
I'm not going to comment about someone who I don't know who is, and I don't want to know who he is. But as I said before, when you send a piece, I don't know if you send the piece unannounced or it was requested from you, etc.
It was requested, and we met. It was for a planned concert, and then I brought him the score, did all the parts, and then put it ready for him and the orchestra to collect, and then yeah, and wasn't asked a thing.
Well, so, were you present at any of the rehearsals?
All of them.
Well, you had an opportunity there after the rehearsal, not during, but after the rehearsal, to approach if the conductor was doing something that was contrary to your intentions, that was your opportunity to approach the conductor and say, you know, in such and such and such a measure. And the conductor very well may say, well, why didn't you write so? And that's your opportunity to say, well, you're right, and maybe I should have been more clear, or I send you a page of explanations or whatever, you know. But that's what rehearsals are for. If you're present there, you have the opportunity to make comments there.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think I was a student at the time, and I think I didn't feel
okay.
I was
okay. Well,
but thank you.
It's a different situation when you're a student or when you're a very young composer with few pieces under your belt, and you approach a performer of note. But when you begin to be more and more and more experienced, and when you become better known, but better known not just in the circle of the workshops of the specialized ensembles, but for instance, I will tell you that if you have a piece for string quartet performed by the Kronos String Quartet, any other string quartet that wishes to do to program a piece by a contemporary composer will look seriously at any piece you write for the string quartet. You know, it's a question of developing a name for yourself.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else? Mary, you seem to be very quiet. Do you have any comments as an educated member of the audience?
Well, obviously, I enjoyed your presentation, and you know, many of the specific approaches and comments that you've made today, we have discussed a priori on the telephone several times. So I could only say that you delivered them today in the fashion in which I expected, and that I hope your comments and guidance has been well received.
Thank you. I appreciate your comment. Well, as I told you at the very beginning to all of you, what I am speaking is directly from my experience. in my approach to this, as in my approach to any piece of music in any style by any composer, I am not dogmatic. Hopefully, the performance that I would do today about X piece is much more realized, much fuller than the performance I did of that piece 10 years ago. And hopefully, if I do it again in 5 or 10 years, it will be more realized and better then. It's a continuously evolving process. Anybody else has any comments at this point or questions?
I actually have a question. Following up from the idea of starting with the people that you know and then progressing from there towards like established ensembles and things. I've been trying to do that actually, like reaching out to ensembles and musicians and things that I know and trying to get things performed with those ensembles. But I've never really known what the procedure is for finding a venue for the concert and for arranging the entire performance, because if you don't have a conductor or a programmer and you're kind of doing that yourself, is it now your responsibility, or whose responsibility is it exactly if you don't have a fixed leader, if that makes sense?
That's a good question. My advice, never send or approach an organization, quote. Nor should you approach the president of the board or the general director or executive director. Always go to the musical head of that institution. Most letters of interest from people who want to be soloists with an ensemble and who want to have their pieces performed, even when sent to the music director, are going to be placed in what I call the circular file cabinet, which is the wastebasket. There is no time for a busy, engaged music director to go through all of that. Much less because if you send it to the president of the board or the executive director, either they will dismiss it out of hand or they will forward it to the music director anyway, which will dismiss it unless there is real serious background behind it. For instance, if you say, dear so-and-so, I will introduce myself, my name is so-and-so, I have had this piece and that piece performed by this ensemble and this ensemble. I have a piece that I would like to call to your attention, to which you may wish to program in your series or in any of your various series, whatever. So it's a way of go straight to the music director. Don't write to the organization. It's a waste of time.
All right. Can I ask, is your music available online somewhere? Because I'm looking at your website, I don't seem to be able to see any or hear any. There's lots of visuals.
Your music that I conducted or music I composed?
I was asking Laura, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
so sorry. But yeah, Ruben, absolutely. Everybody should share their details.
Music that I composed. Yeah.
As a duo.
Oh, yeah. We both sort of have our own SoundClouds for
okay.
because we both compose separately, obviously. So yeah. So if you look us up individually, that's.
I see.
But we also have some of the on our music archive. We have some pieces that we wrote there as well.
Okay, cool.
Well, if there are no other questions, I want to thank you all for your attention. My goal was to give you something to think about. You may agree with all of it, none of it, or in between, but I hope that in all cases, I have given you something to think about. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. It was really, really helpful and so informative. Thank you so much for your valuable time, Ruben. And it's also been incredibly inspiring as well, actually, to hear from you. So it's been a great pleasure and honour. And thanks everyone for supporting us and joining this forum. Coming up, we're conducting some research actually about, and I've created a questionnaire to establish the needs of students and graduates composing in the current conditions. It would be incredibly helpful if you could complete this for us and share it with anyone of relevance. I'm going to post a link here in the chat. So if you could save it, that would be great. Yeah, so the questionnaire itself is totally anonymous, and the information will be used solely to ascertain how certain issues have affected composers and musicians over the past year. So these include the impact of the pandemic that it has had on the financial situation, job prospects, mental health, creativity, dissemination of work, and general interaction with other professional musicians. We hope to use this information to get funding from the Arts Council for the further development of the forum as a non-profit project. And we hope to expand it and include more opportunities and reach out to a greater demographic. So our plans for the future include interviewing more people like Ruben, who are specialists in the field of a variety of disciplines, including contemporary performance, improvisation, or composition, or even work in other media, such as dance, film, drama, literature, and art, so we can build new sources of inspiration, find new sources of inspiration, and interact and network with new fields the end of the creative arts industry. And we also want to introduce composer schemes which give composers the chance to have their work rehearsed, recorded, and performed, because one thing that I experienced as a student for like 5 years, I never really had an opportunity till recently to actually have my works recorded properly and rehearsed properly. So that's one thing that we want to make more accessible to people now as well. So our ultimate goal is basically to give young aspiring musicians and composers the chance to gain exposure, receive valuable feedback, and get insight from a range of specialists across the creative arts industry. So any feedback or criticism or advice is really valued. And so if you'd like to email us at atafeliora@gmail.com, we really value your opinion. And finally, if you have any feedback about your experience this evening, also please get in touch. We would also appreciate if you would share this with friends and family, as it would help us to widen the audience that we reach and give our composers greater exposure. As I said before, we usually showcase the work of different composers, so this would really help composers to have their works listened to and responded to. So so thanks again for joining us. Our next session will actually be in September, because we're going to have a bit of a break over the summer. I look forward to seeing you all there, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you all.
You all.
Bye.
Thank you. Take care.
You too.
Oh, Ronnie, I'll drop you an email, by the way.
Oh, fantastic. Wicked.
All right.
See you later.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.